Namaste and good evening. I take pleasure in informing that Sahitya Akademi has recently brought out yet another seminal publication titled A House of Words, Festschrift in honor of Keki and Daruwalla. And this is edited by Usha Akelaji. The seminal book edited by Usha Akelaji has reflections, memoirs, interviews, and poetics by 30 writers gathered to shine light on the literary legend Keki in Daruwalla. The Festschrift discloses Kekiji as friend, critic, poet, short story writer, novelist, editor, reviewer, political critic, and human being. Usha Akelaji has done a phenomenal job in editing this grand work. Hearty thanks to her. Thanks also to Penguin India and Speaking Tiger for their hearty cooperation. The book will be discussed at the program. Thanks to Professor Malashri Lalji, the convener of Sahitya Akademi's English Advisory Board, for recommending to invite a panel of such eminent scholars, writers, poets, and critics to discuss the book and several dimensions of Kekiji's writings. We have with us Professor Sanyukta Das ji to share her insights into the book and to moderate the program as well. We have Dr. Basudhara Roy ji, Professor Harish Trivedi ji, Professor Malashri Lal ji, Namita Gokhale ji, Ranjit Hoskote ji, Dr. Sukrita Paul Kumar ji, and the editor of the book, Usha Akela ji. Before I invite Professor Sanyukta Das ji to take the charge of the forum, I request Dr. K. Srinivas Rao ji, Secretary, Sahitya Akademi, to please say a few words to welcome all the reputed participants and the ones who are watching this program live on YouTube. Dr. K. Srinivas Rao, Secretary, Sahitya Akademi.
Yeah, thank you, Krishna. Professor Sanjukta Das Gupta, moderator of this event. Professor Harish Trivedi ji, distinguished scholar, writer, critic, and translator. And Dr. Ranjit Hoskote ji, distinguished poet, translator, curator, art critic, and cultural theorist. Srimati Namita Gokhale ji, eminent writer, editor, and festival director. Professor Malashri Lal ji, eminent scholar and also the convener of Sahitya Akademi's English Advisory Board. Professor Sukrita Paul Kumar ji, eminent writer and editor of Indian literature. Professor Basudhara Rai, eminent poet and writer. Dr. Usha Akela ji, editor and compiler of A House of Words. And all those friends who are watching this program in Academy's YouTube and Facebook channels. I'm glad to welcome all of you for this edition of book discussion where all these distinguished scholars will be discussing A House of Words, that is a collection of tributes to Sri Keki Daruwalla ji, distinguished poet, writer, critic, editor, and scholar, and his body of works. This platform has witnessed works of many eminent poets in all the languages. Reading of poetry of those poets have lifted the spirit and inspired many. Keki sir is a doyen in the contemporary literary milieu. It is very difficult not to be taken in his poetry, by his poetry. They are something all of us, we Indians, need on a daily basis. Fresh, ironical, tensile, they serve as mirrors to the reality, and whatever reflections are there in the mirror are something that we have to see and improve ourselves. If we want to improve ourselves, that is. In front of scholars, I do not want to talk much, but share some of my thoughts about Keki sir. A little bit of what I have read and how deep the impressions his poems have left in me. More than anything, I'm very grateful to Keki sir for all kindness and love he showed, and I'm very lucky to be living in the same era in which sir is living. Keki ji and his poems stand as reflections of multiculturalism, that is the very nerve and fabric of India. I often feel that he does not stand apart from the metaphysical philosophies nor does he use myths as tools, but unearths the deeper truth from them, mixes it with concrete reality, and dishes out exotic feasts for all of us to enjoy even as we learn from them and educate ourselves. When one goes through the poems of Keki sir, one would feel like they are witnessing Sarva Sakshin. Everything flows in time, and yet nothing moves, and behind all these, there is Kekiji to tell the tales. Not grand ones, but yet at the same time, not the ones that get bogged down in details. His philosophical nuances is something remarkable, going far behind philos plus sophia, as if he physically traversing in space-time rather than space and time. I'm very happy that this discussion is happening, though I would have preferred a physical meet, but then virtual is convenient to all in some ways and geographical distance gets removed. The book has been wonderfully curated by Dr. Usha Akella, and my special thanks to Professor Malashri Lalji, who is the convener of Sahitya Academy's Advisory Board, English Advisory Board, has been ever present, and due to their efforts, the book has come out beautifully. My sincere thanks to both of them. I sincerely hope all the poetry lovers lay their hands on this work, and in my opinion, this book is a must for all those who wish to understand and learn how to appreciate the wisdom of a poet. Is Keki sir a myth maker, a master magician who knows the pulse of humanity? Is he a humanist rather than a dry philosopher? Is he a Buddha, Jung, Borges, Kalidasa, all put together? That is a question. So I don't know. For me, he is always the loud Keki sir and I, the ignorant fool. Thank you all.
Very nice.
Thanks a lot, sir, for your warm
Excellent.
words. Now I invite Professor Sanyukta Dasgupta ji to take over. Dr. Sanyukta Dasgupta ji, professor and former head, Department of English and former dean, Faculty of Arts, Calcutta University, is an eminent poet, short story writer, critic, and translator. She was a member of the General Council of Sahitya Akademi and was convener of the Academy's English Advisory Board. She is the president of Intercultural Poetry and Performance Library, Kolkata. She has received the WEI Kamala Das Poetry Award in 2020 and the Ethos Literary Award 2022. She has 24 published books to her credit. Professor Dr. Sanyukta Dasgupta ji.
Thank you, Krishna. Hello, everyone. Good evening from India to those joining from different time zones, including the editor of House of Words, Usha Akella. Good evening, Keki. I hope you are there. Warm greetings from all the panelists here who are all your very, very dear friends. It is indeed a moment of immense joy and celebration that Sahitya Academy has published a House of Words in honor of poet, novelist, short story writer, travel writer, and columnist, the incomparable Keki Daruwalla, a stellar man of letters and a most lovable human being. Not a very common combination. Here we need to also acknowledge that it is due to the active participation and support of Grace Srinivasa Rao, who just spoke, our Secretary, Sahitya Academy, and Dr. Krishna Kimbone, Deputy Secretary, and Parameshwaran, that the well-formatted A House of Words with its splendid cover image of a smiling Keki Daruwalla wearing a maroon shirt resides as hard copies in our respective homes. It is more than expected that when approximately 30 college and university teachers of English literature and language have contributed to the construction of a house of words, this volume had to be named Festschrift, the phonetically vibrant German signifier. It could not really be a feeble, twittering tribute. It had to be a Festschrift, a celebratory publication in honor of Keki and Daruwalla. This house of words has been built with respect, admiration, camaraderie, and limitless love as its primary construction materials. So this house of words is, of course, not just any house. This house of words is a multi-storied mansion with countless rooms, balconies, doors, and windows of perception. From the empirical to the epistemic and the ontological. Needless to add, there are no locks, security guards, or CCTVs installed in this house of words. Such has been the reputation of poet Keki Daruwalla, Keki to all his friends, readers, and admirers, that I remember in the event to celebrate his 85th birthday, curated by Boshidhara Roy and Joydeep Sarangi on 23rd January 2022, in those dreadful COVID times, there was almost a virtual stampede in the Zoom room as the rock star of Indian English poetry, Keki Daruwalla, read his poems and spoke about his fascinating literary career that has spanned more than 50 years. Keki has consistently proved his skill as a writer in multiple genres, as observed by the 34 contributors whose thoughtful essays and pieces enrich this incomparable book. Keki had once described my own scribbles as trigger tense poetry at its best. And it makes me feel that in many respects, I have very humbly followed the leader who, in his own poem, Death by Burial, wrote, half the village could be Hindu, half Muslim. Enough cause for a riot, with half the village shouting, death by fire, and the other half, death by burial. The strength of Keki's poetry derives equally from his use of symbols, images, and metaphors, culled from the home and the world, as always from a craftsmanship which is creative and flexible and not repetitive, but consistently experimental in its use of content and form. About the poems in Under Orion, his first book of published poems, 1970, there was a bit of confusion there in terms of publication, which Professor Harish Dwivedi has pointed out in his contribution to this tribute, to this Festschrift. And about Under Orion, the poet Nizam Ezekiel had commented, a fine blend of freedom and discipline, metrical rhythms, and the word order of prose, compact, harsh, alliterative phrasing, and relaxed movement. This description is true of almost all of Keki Daruwalla's poems, published in 12 volumes of poetry so far. In late 2021, Keki sent me a copy of his autographed book, Night Fever, with this generous and absolutely unexpected handwritten note for Sanjukta in admiration and respect and much love. I still remain overwhelmed and deeply humbled. Significantly, in the prologue to the island poems in this book, Night Fever, in the inimitable Keki brand of wordplay, Keki wrote, a poem is an island in itself. Heartburn and frostburn lie outside the page. A poet who is not afraid to return a government award a poet who resorts to asking tough questions in his newspaper articles, wherein he critiques the administration for demolishing all vestiges of ethics and social justice, truly stands apart. Keki's poetry is simultaneously cerebral, empathetic, honest, and sophisticated, and demands a critically informed mind and emotional engagement to savor the intrepid playfulness of his nuanced poetry. I will end by reading a quatrain from Keki's book of poems, Naishapur and Babylon, which I have also quoted in my tribute, if you have been able to read through the book. And this is the quatrain which I want to share with you as I end. What if quill and tablet have been impounded? I have dipped my fingers in my heart's blood and pain. What if the tongue is sealed? I have kept a tongue in each link of my iron chains. Thank you so much. And now we begin the discussion session about A House of Words in the order in which the names of the panelists have been listed. So now I'm delighted to invite the talented poet and critic Boshudhara Roy, a very dear young friend who played a pivotal role in curating A House of Words, to share her observations about the making of A House of Words. And as most of you know, Boshudhara teaches English at Karim City College, affiliated to Kothan University, Chaibasa. Drawn to gender and ecological studies, she is the author of 3 poetry collections. Her recent work is available at Outlook India, and she has been shortlisted for the DKM Poetry Prize 2021. She writes and reviews from Jamshedpur, Jharkhand. Over to you, Boshudhara.
Thank you very much, Sanjukta Di, and what a beautiful organization by the Sahitya Akademi, and what a wonderful book to be celebrating this evening. It's very apt that Sanjukta Di is moderating this event, because very honestly, the idea of a Festschrift volume originated via Sanjukta Di's mind. It was Sanjukta Di who thought that all this exuberant outpouring of love for Keki Daruwalla on the virtual plane, on the Zoom discussion that we were having as a birthday celebration, should have some kind of documentation, should have some kind of record. And it was Sanjukta Di who suggested to both Professor Jaideep Sarangi and myself that we could think of a Festschrift volume. And this would probably not have happened had, the same ideas not struck Usha. And when we communicated, she was thinking along similar lines and more than willing to take up this very, very significant labor of love. It has been very special to have a book like this, because most of the time we believe in our literary traditions, we believe in some kind of a posthumous recognition. We believe in arriving at a kind of critical consensus about a writer long after he or she is no more in the world. But it is very significant that we honor writers in their lifetime. And this is, I believe, a very valuable step in this regard, because for certain writers, there is this general consensus of their presence, their value, and their significance in the world. For Keki Daruwalla, and for this, as Sanjukta Di very rightly pointed out, this is a multi-storied house. This is a huge house, and there is a sense of borderlessness. There are no demarcations, because we celebrate, and Usha kept that in mind, that when we were putting together this book, she kept in mind the various dimensions. She had very methodically taken down notes. She wanted to represent Keki Daruwalla as a poet, as a fiction writer, as a as a columnist, as a journalist, though that was a front, I think, that we could not get adequate contributors for. But this was the general idea, to present the very prismatic individual that Keki Daruwalla was. And his significance, I think, that all of us have acknowledged in this book is the fact that he was not just writing. For all these 50 years or more, he has not just been writing, but he has also very actively been reading. He has been reading his contemporary writers, he has been reading Indian writers, and he has been reading younger writers, and has been very free with mentorship, with advice, with guidance. And this is something that not many people do. The kind of support that Keki Daruwalla has always offered fiction writers and young poets is something that I believe has set into motion what we call the idea of a tradition, because we need to have a sense of tradition to continue a literary landscape. We are talking about a literary continuum, and that continuum calls for the sense of renewal. And I think A House of Words does just that. Not only will it be very significant for scholars of poetry, it will also be very significant for poets, because poets do not just leave behind poems. They also leave behind something of themselves in the world. And how much we leave behind to the world, how much we give of ourselves in the various human interactions that we have, I think determines the extent of influence of an individual. And Keki Daruwalla, from that perspective, has a very wide influence. There is practically no one in the literary sphere whose life has been untouched by him. And that probably is the greatest testimony of a life well lived, and which I hope that the readers of A House of Words will be able to acknowledge. I'm very confident that this is a book which will be of immense value to scholars of poetry, as we hope, which will carry Keki Daruwalla into classrooms, but it will also be significant to continue the idea of a tradition of Indian English poetry, because we do not have such a kind of documentation for Nazim Ezekiel, though it is probably at work. Kavita Ezekiel, his daughter, has put together a very celebratory volume. It is in the publication process. And I believe that works like these need to be continued by editors like Usha, who can take up such indefatigable projects with the sole purpose that there is a documentation not just of poetry, not just of publications, but also of the extent of influence that a person has had. And this, I hope, is the beginning of a series. Thank you very much, Usha, for making me a part of this journey. Thank you very much to the Sahitya Akademi for publishing and supporting this project, and for having me here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Boshithara. Very well spoken. And of course, as always, you have told us how exactly this very, very extraordinary book has come about. And at the same time, you emphasized that we need not read the poems as texts only, but the poet as text. So I will invite the next speaker, for Professor Harish Trivedi, our own Harish, as he just now warned Usha that no, I'm not Dr. Trivedi. So, Harish, over to you and the jaunty elegance of Keki Daruwalla.
Thank you, Sanjukta. One thing about Festschrift says, it's a German rule, it's a German word, it's a German custom that on the day of publication, it is actually presented to the man or the woman it's honoring. How I wish that was so.
Yeah.
All of us who have known, all of us know Keki, all the contributors to the book as well, not only here on this, those of us here on this panel. And that's one thing with great people whom one has known, great writers. If we have known them personally, then on occasions like this, we think of the person first and the achievement afterwards. And there are no words to say how much we miss Keki on this occasion, such as the irony of fate and destiny that he cannot be with us. The book is a splendid tribute to him. There's so many people, mostly poets and novelists and writers themselves, come together to honor one of the greatest of the kind in our generation. There's never been any doubt in my mind that there are three great poets so far in Indian writing in English, just as there were before Rushdie three great novelists, the Trinity. And they are, to my mind, Ramanujan and Nissim and Keki. There's no doubt at all in my mind that they stand heads and shoulders above all the rest. They will also become great, some of us, I think, some of you, I should say. And there'll be another generation and there'll be another time. But right now, Keki is as great as it gets among Indian English poets. He's not only a poet, he's also a novelist. He's developed a second reputation as a novelist, as a short story writer. I was reading today Going, the title story in the latest volume called Going, and what a beautiful story it is of three generations of women interacting, grandmother, mother, and granddaughter. It's a very accomplished writer of the greatest caliber who can do that. As about his poetry, one thing that I find very remarkable is that for our times, it's even more remarkable, he is a classical poet. He is not a romantic poet. He has that same tremendous regard for form which marks a classical poet. His craftsmanship is superb. Jaunty elegance is one part of the title that I've given to my own article here. The second part is measured cadence.
Right.
The measure, the cadence, both going together and resonating in our minds, independent of the words almost. It's, again, a great and rare achievement. He's a classical writer, he's a public poet, and he is not a romantic poet. What he's not is, again, extremely remarkable, because most poets, somewhere or the other, perhaps more than somewhere or the other, all along are romantic poets. To be a poet and not be romantic seems to be, for many people, a contradiction in terms. I liked immensely an answer that he gave to Usha in the interview in this book, in which Usha is saying, there are not many love poems in your oeuvre. There are poems to wife, mother, daughters, but not the kind of love poems that we usually call love poems. And in the answer, Keki says, if I had a few affairs, that would have enriched my poetry. I love this man. I mean, there are so many reasons in the world for having affairs, but I'd never thought of this one, that somebody would want to have an affair to enrich his work, his writing, his poetry. It's not a lack, his not being a romantic poet. Most romantic poets are more romantic than poets. It's very easy. That route, the harder path, is the one taken by Keki. His fiction has a trajectory that is independent of his poetry. His poetry in the beginning was very gritty. Under Orion, most of the poems set in Barabanki, a town that I know from my own childhood. The Ghagara I've seen in Spate, wonderful early poem by Keki. From Barabanki, his journey has been as a poet to Babylon, from Barabanki to Babylon. But that's because he, meanwhile, began writing fiction. And the nitty-gritty of the poetry that was there in Under Orion could now be parked in his fiction. And therefore, his poetry could rove as widely as possible in a trans-civilizational way. The Persians, the Greeks, he goes abroad not to the UK or the USA, as a poet writing in English might be, but he develops his own global perspective on older civilizations. I wouldn't say more, not only because I have to go shortly to a birthday party where the birthday girl, an aunt of mine, is going to be 90 years old. So I have to leave shortly. I'll keep track of this on my phone as I travel. It's a long ride. But I'll conclude this with again going back to thinking of Keki as he finds himself and as we find him today. One of the things that Keki and I have shared over the years is a love of Urdu poetry. And I will cite a couplet by Mirza Ghalib. ऐसे कुछ बात है जिससे चुप हूं वरना क्या बात करनी ही आती. There is a reason why I'm silent. It's not as if I don't know how to talk.
Oh, cool.
And in the same ghazal, there is another one. हम जहां हैं वहां से हमको भी कुछ हमारी खबर नहीं है. I'm at a place now where even I can get no news of how I'm doing. But here's hoping and praying that he'll be back with us. And that as soon as I got the book, House of Words, the first thought that came to me was, I should ring up Keki and fix up an evening meeting at the bar in the IRC to go over this book, piece by piece. And I hope there's a dream that I have, and I hope that it will come to pass. I hope against hope, perhaps, that it will come to pass. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Harish Trivedi. Harish, and he needs no introduction, which is why I did not introduce him. That is a formality which I skipped. But I need to add a postscript that Professor Harish Trivedi is an internationally acclaimed public intellectual and was former professor of English at the University of Delhi, was visiting professor at the universities of Chicago and London. He's the author, editor of several academic works in post-colonial studies, translation studies, comparative literature, and world literature. And among his books, which many of you have read, there is also post-colonial translation theory and practice. And he has proved himself to be a very fine translator by translating those two pieces for us. Thank you. So there I'm inserting translator as well in that little bio now. Thank you, Harish. So may I now invite the next speaker, our next panelist, that is somebody also very well known internationally, Namita Gokhale, writer and festival director, has authored 20 works of fiction and non-fiction. Her acclaimed debut novel, Paro, Dream of Passion, was published in 1984. Jaipur Journals is set in the vibrant Jaipur Literature Festival, of which Gokhale is founder, director. She was conferred the first Centenary National Award for Literature by the Assam Sahitya Sabha in 2017. And she was also awarded the Sahitya Academy Prize in English in 2022 and the Valley of Words Jury Award, and was also longlisted for the International Dublin Literary Award. Namita Gokhale.
Wonderful to join you all. Can you hear me?
Yes, Namita.
So thank you, Usha, for this wonderful book. It's a fitting tribute to my dear friend, Keki, and I'm so delighted to be here with so many other friends. The House of Words, even the title brings together the well, not the political and the personal, but even more than that, the personal and the poetical. And I quite agree with Harish that he is not tainted by romance. He is one of the he's a hard realist with a sense of the classical, that he only appreciates what endures. My association with Keki, and I hope you're listening, Keki, I'll come and see you with a copy of the book soon and we'll have a conversation. At least I'll tell you what I think about what's been happening here and there. My association with Keki Daruwalla is now 4 decades old, as is my last book, my first book. I knew him as the iconic poet who was also a policeman, because my father, Mr. M.C. Pant, was in the Indian Police Service, and Keki was a colleague, though considerably younger. Then in 1984, the year my debut novel, Paro Dreams of Passion, was first published, Keki received the Sahitya Academy Award for his collection of poetry, The Keeper of the Dead. My novel, though successful in the larger world, drew immense criticism in India for many different reasons, but mainly because it was considered too bold for the pen of a well-brought-up Indian girl. I was 28. And in a long review in the Indian Express, Keki took it upon himself to defend me in a thoughtful and erudite way. This act of generosity won my deep and lasting gratitude, which in time blossomed into friendship. This essay is a tribute to the man, the poet, the unblinking fair-mindedness that attaches to all that he does and all that he writes. And I know that the sentiment of gratitude that I feel for that early act of kindness is shared by so many other once young poets and writers who he blurbed, who wrote forwards for. He is unfailingly been generous in sharing his reputation and his fame with those who just need to get past the gatekeepers and be heard. Let me catalog some books, some memories, some poems we've already heard about now. I will speak of his novels and short stories before I move to the poetry, because I'm not very good at poetry. There are worthier poets than me sitting here. I just am a humble practitioner of prose. But I believe that Keki is even more important. I mean that he's more important as a prose writer, which is a tough act because he's very, very important as a poet. And his novels will well stand the test of time, as will the verse. And then I remember being there at the launch of For Pepper and Christ, which came out in 2009. It was his first published novel, and it got an ecstatic reaction from an overflowing hall at the Habitat, I think it was. This book was a grand and magnificent adventure through history at the times of Vasco da Gama, taking us into the heart of the spice trade, examining Eastern sophistication, I quote, Eastern sophistication and Western ambition. And this reflects in what Harish said just now, that there are so many aspects internationally of the rest of the world, of the Middle East, of Persia, and of not just the US or the UK or a old-fashioned Anglophile, which inhabit his work. This was followed by Ancestral Affairs, which is a moving and masterful evocation of pre-partition India. It's so humorous, it is so funny, it is so raw in its humor, and so immediate because it was garnered from some childhood memories which illuminated in Junagadh. And I was personally involved in the publishing of this particular book. And so I know it closely. And it was published by HarperCollins. Shoma Ghoshal got it published. And I know that book really well, having read it a few times. Then there are those numerous collections of sharp, taut, and evocative short stories. And I was just trying, the one I had read recently means a year ago, in a Speaking Tiger collection. I cannot now recall the name, but it was masterclass. And then there was Swerving to Solitude, Letters to Mama, of which I wrote in a review that at a time when history has become a distorted mirror, Swerving to Solitude made us journey through forgotten pasts with the sure touch of a master. Now, of the memories, so many of them are there. And the particular memory I always end up talking about, and I've also spoken about it in my essay, is a train journey with Nirmal Verma and Keki to Amritsar in the late 90s. And we spoke in a very prestigious college there about to the literary audience, students. And it was one of the warmest, happiest, most joyous literary experiences I've ever had. With Nirmalji's quiet humor and Keki's more robust sense of the comic. And there were these wonderful cakes with the wonderful lady students of Amritsar had provided us, many, many cakes. But one of the students got up and started attacking me, saying that my novel was a dirty book. And I remember then pointing to Nirmal and saying, why don't you read his books? I mean, at least I'm not so old, and so you should forgive my generation. But he's one generation before me. And is it because he's a man that you're not accusing him of writing a dirty book? And both these gentlemen stood up and defended me so gallantly. It was a lovely, joyous afternoon. Then there was this writer's retreat, which I curated with Roli Books in Mussoorie in 2002, which was again a Festschrift to honor Ruskin Brand we had gathered for. And there was a merry band of friends with ghost stories before the fireplace late into the night, with many stories from Ruskin himself, and some fine photographic portraits, including there's a compelling one of Keki by the great photographer Harmeet Singh. I couldn't access it and give it to Usha, but I will share it sometime, because Harmeet sadly is not with us, so I couldn't get permission from him. And there are memories of dinners in his house, of the warmth of his thoughtful hospitality, the outstanding food, the conversation, the camaraderie. The last time I went around to see him was to get a blurb for a particular book, somebody else's book. And he took out a fine bottle of cognac. He said, I was waiting for a special occasion, and you are the one. And he gave it to me. I mean, not the bottle, but a lovely large drink. Walked me outside. It was wonderful. I think I had gone with Devapriya Roy. These are memories crowded with readings, public events, Keki's measured, calibrated voice, imparting its own rhythmic music to the words. He knew, I think only he knew how to read his poetry in that particular way. And Keki is always courteous and honoring his colleagues when they have a book event or a launch. And I was immensely touched to see him at event at the Sahitya Academy for Things to Leave Behind. And there was another event recently. He made it there and sat quietly in the audience. And he's been a light, a torch, and a beacon through these 40 years I've spent with the Indian literary community across regions, across languages. His magnanimity and his generosity, as well as his critical faculties and fair-mindedness, exemplify a generation and an age. And it is really about the personal and the poetical. And thank you again, Usha, for compiling this book of remembrance and appreciation. And I salute Keki for the tenderness of his vision, the unrelenting, uncompromising truthfulness of his word, for the creative genius of his imagination. The day is yours, Keki, and the poetry will speak for itself. People have spoken of it, all the previous speakers, but the 12 volumes will speak and continue to speak for themselves from bookshelves and from readings and in memory. And Sanjukta talked about the limitless love people have, at least I do, and so many of my friends do. And K.S. Rao referred to him as a master magician. I mean, so much of what was said before me just resonated inside me deeply. And then there was Harish, who talked about the measured cadence of his classical poet. And so these are some of the ways in which I remember him, see him, and see you soon, Keki. And thank you again, all of you, for inviting me to be a part of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Namita. And those anecdotes and recollections of moments spent with Keki really brought him alive. I felt that he was there listening to all of us, and I'm sure he is. And it was a wonderful appraisal of Keki as a novelist also, and Keki as a poet. Thank you so much. And now I will invite Ranjit Hoskote. Ranjit, are you there? So,
Yes, very much. I thought it was Molashri, so to speak, but
no, we thought that we would pop in Bombay now. Yeah.
all right, why not?
All right. So Ranjit is an eminent poet, translator, and curator. Recently, he edited the book Under the Same Sky, published by Sahitya Academy and the Ministry of Culture, Government of India, on the occasion of G20, which include poetry by the poets from G20 member countries. I know your bio is much, much longer than this, but right now we will ask you to talk about Keki, the way you look upon him as a person, as a poet, as a writer, or as a friend.
Thank you so much, Sanjukta. And let me say what an honor it is to be speaking here, to be here at all, because unfortunately, I'm not a contributor to this volume. That's entirely my own fault. But I do want to join you in expressing my great sense of gratitude to Keki and to celebrate his life and his work. And I would like, in the first place, to really express my admiration for all the marvelous work that the Sahitya Academy does, and for which it doesn't always get the credit it should receive. And this Festschrift is really, it's a benchmark. It is the kind of publication that we should have to celebrate this great generation of poets, of writers, to whom we still look for inspiration. And I also want to congratulate Usha Akela for having taken on this editorial mandate and for having served it in conditions that have not always been conducive. I mean, you've in some sense you've been at a distance from the country, but intimately close to its literary questions, its political crises. And I want to dwell on, you know, as Namita was speaking particularly, I thought back over nearly 40 years of having known Keki, of having been the recipient of his generosity through advice, through reviews, and just friendship. The many times that we hosted his readings here at Poetry Circle, or the BN Volunteer Center come back to mind, meetings at the IIC come back to mind. So much of what is relayed from one generation of poets to another doesn't necessarily take written form. It also comes through what you might want to call alekhe, something not put down in writing, something that comes through conversation. And when I think back, somewhat in the spirit of Eliot's tradition and the individual talent, what was it like for me as a poet, publishing his early work in the late 1980s? What was it like to look around at the phalanx of Anglophone poetry in India? Who did I respond to the most? I have to say it was 5 figures, really. My guru, my first mentor, Nissim Ezekiel, was a very, very important figure to me, as was Dom Barres. Both of these were Bombay poets. But outside of Bombay, I responded very, very strongly to the work of Agha Shahid Ali, and then in Amherst, A.K. Ramanujan in Chicago, and very crucially to Keki's work and his example. And I want to dwell a little on why it's these particular figures and why what kind of space Keki occupies in this phalanx. I think what attracted me immensely to these 5 figures is that they were not narrowly constituted, if you will, as practitioners of poetry alone. They had rich interior lives, which were expressed in diverse genres. They also had very demanding external public engagements. Nissim was a poet. He was a writer of plays as well. He was a playwright. He was an anthologist and an editor, a teacher, and actively involved through one phase of his life in the larger politics of the nation state. Dom was a poet, but also a writer of prose, a distinguished writer of prose. He was also an international diplomat. Shahid was a poet and a translator, and probably single-handedly brought about the, sorry, I'm just going to fix this. Single-handedly brought the ghazal to the literary consciousness of North America and into the English language. Ramanujan was a foundational cultural anthropologist and folklorist, apart from being a poet and a seminal translator. And Keki truly captivated and held my attention because he, in some ways, his work resonated very, very strongly with what I felt as a very young practitioner was crucial. What was most amazing about his work is the way in which he took on history as a subject. His personae, the persona poems, whether it was the king speaks to the scribe, for instance, and later, as he speaks through the voice, the mask of the alchemist or the scribe elsewhere or the scholar in West Africa, there was a profound sense of liberation that one did not have to write poetry from the romantic ground of the individual insecure self beset by its own private anxieties. Here was a poet who spoke of how you, as a poet, could come and go among different kinds of historical predicaments, assume different personae, take on crises, and thereby establish a kind of affinity with other times and places. This was, to me, a very liberating and enabling gesture in my own work. And I was always very, very aware that Keki's poetry came at a great cost, that his public engagements came from the heart of the nation state and from state machinery. We all know his distinguished career in the Indian Police Service, the diplomatic roles that he played, and eventually his role in the national security apparatus. So this is why so much of his poetry shines forth, because it's hard won. It's won in the face of profound ethical challenges, moral choices to be made. What does it mean to be in a position to exercise violence? What does it mean to have a certain relationship of control towards the multitudes? Keki is not an armchair intellectual in any sense. This is someone who's been out there quelling riots, dealing with conspiracies, maintaining law and order, predicting possible disturbances, and through it all asking himself, how does this affect me as a poet? What is the stance that I take towards the other? I think that, to me, that moral responsibility that comes through in his poetry is crucial towards people, towards other species, and towards landscapes that are in danger of exploitation and extraction. Again, you'll see that his poetry from the 70s and 80s prefigures in many ways what we today are calling eco-poetry or eco-poetics. I also want to dwell a little on why his cultural pluralism is so important to me as a young poet and to many of us in our various disciplines and domains. And I want to dwell a little here on his, if you will, his ethnic identity. He was, when I first got to know him in the late 80s and early 90s, he made for a very, very different kind of Parsi. Growing up in Western India, to me, the Parsis were a Bombay community with a certain profound role and a major contribution to make to the history of my home city. But Keki's cultural coordinates were very different. They were Lahore, Quetta, Ranikhet, Delhi, Barabanki. It was amazing to hear him speak Urdu, move into Punjabi. It's an incredibly multilingual consciousness. It comes from the Shivaliks, from the Gangetic heartland. And looking back, I think that is something that was also very enabling to me. Because one of the questions I've had to deal with constantly is, what does it mean to be effectively a monolingual writer in English, yet to be a multilingual reader and a multilingual speaker? How do these different languages that we speak and read inform our work in the one language we choose to write in. I think that that would be a point of affinity between Keki and Raman as well, Keki Daruwalla and A.K. Ramanujan as well. That also leads me to another aspect of his work that I found immensely attractive. And for good or ill, some of us are stuck with this label of being Bombay poets. And I spent the formative years of my childhood in a Goa that was still very Indo-Iberian, very pristine, very green. And the natural world was something that struck me, that it was always an immediate habitat to me. Once again, it was Keki's poetry that in some sense enabled me to take that up as a legitimate subject, are the ways in which we are interrelated with nature, not as a separate and sovereign species, but as a species who are enmeshed with the destinies of other species. And it's his evocations of landscape that are very real, very vibrant to me. Equally vibrant to me are his journeys, the explorations in space and time. Other distinguished speakers have spoken of these. It could be Mauryan India, it could be ancient Greece, it could be Persia in different epochs, the Mediterranean, West Africa. This transcultural and what I would call confluential range of references is not just a cartography of references. It's a way of investing the self in these different predicaments and periods. Again, I would think that this comes from being Parsi, having floral heritage, having a sense of distributed location across time and space. And I think that that's something that again allows us to think about identity not in a rooted, anchored, territorially bounded way, but rather to think of identity as something that is built from lattices, from networks, from journeys and migrations. I also found very, very inspiring through this generation, but you particularly see it in Keki, what it meant to belong to a generation that had been emancipated by reading Penguin's Modern Poetry in Translation series. The way in which Greek poets in translation are real and immediate and present to Keki at various points in his career. This to me is again a way of establishing dialogues with colleagues in other situations, writing in other languages. And here I'd like to think about Keki as a builder of bridges. Here's the poet as bridge builder. And then as I conclude, I'd like to think about how, once again, his ability to speak truth to power does not come from a marginal place. Normally, we think about speaking truth to power as proceeding from a marginal situation, a victim position. This is a man who was inside the state. He came from within the establishment. And through much of his career, he played both of these roles. And to my mind, he had far more at stake than many other people. There was much more at risk. And yet, through those decades, he also spoke with great courage about things that were going wrong in larger public life. I'll conclude by reading a poem that's really lived in my head for decades. It's Wolf. It goes like this. Fire lit, half silhouette and half myth, the wolf circles my past, treading the leaves into a bed till he sleeps, black snout on extended paws, black snout on sulfur body, he nudged his way into my consciousness, prowler, wind sniffer, throat catcher. His cries drew a ring around my night. A child's night is a village on the forest edge. My mother said, his ears stand up at the fall of dew. He can sense a shadow move across a hedge on a dark night. He can sniff out your approaching dreams. There is nothing that won't be lit up by the dark torch of his eyes. The wolves have been slaughtered now. A hedge of smoking gun barrels rings my daughter's dreams. And I remember a time when people would look at this poem and immediately say, oh, Ted Hughes, Thought Fox. And you want to say, no, it's not the same poem. It's not the same set of concerns. It's not about a poem coming to life. It's about the poem rippling out into a larger world of violence and extinctions. And where it comes from is really exactly the tragic vision which lies at the center of the classical sensibility. Classicism is not only about rejecting romantic flourish, it's also about recognizing time and decay as a source of that both depletes you, but also shapes you. And, this is what I will always hold dear and I will always cherish in Keki's work, this tragic vision, which has to do not only with empires and kingdoms and republics, but also has to do with our relationship to the ecologies that should sustain us, but which we destroy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ranjit. And as I told you the first time we met, that you really beat us at our own game. This is a very, very professorial, pedagogic, research scholar presentation. Fascinating. You touched all the aspects of Keki as text and also the texts of Keki. This is absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, Ranjit. Now we move on to the next panelist, Sukrita Paul Kumar. Are you there, Sukrita? Yes. All right. Sukrita is, again, needs no introduction. She is a noted poet and critic, and she was born in Kenya and has published several collections of poems, translations, and many critical books. Her most recent collections of poems are Vanishing Words and Dreamcatcher. She has been an invited poet at the International Writing Program, Iowa, USA, and a poet in residence in Hong Kong. She's a former fellow of the IIAS Shimla. She's a recipient of many fellowships and residencies, and she held the Aruna Asif Ali Chair at the University of Delhi. Currently, she's the co-editor of Writer in Context series of volumes published by Routledge, UK. Her area of interest is partition and comparative literature, but I don't think her area of interest is limited to that. Only the other day she edited a volume on tribal literature, which many of you probably have become aware of. It's an Indian literature volume, and she is working round the clock in making Indian literature the most vibrant journal available in India. Sukrita Paul Kumar.
Thank you very much, Sanjukta, and I'm feeling very honored to be amongst very, very erudite company, because you're very right when you say that people like Ranjit, they give you a complex, being outside of the academic world and sounding so professorial. And we've tried very hard to be what you are in the context of acquiring this kind of language, but I will dwindle into my own style, which really means that it's very non-professorial. However, what I do want to say is my entry into a house of words, how did it happen and why? Because yes, I have also always wanted to be reassured of my own identity, to find that sense of belonging, my home, etc. And Keki has always been a very, very beautiful presence, not only because of the proximity that we have with each other here in Delhi, because we would bump into each other all the time at IIC, willy-nilly, we would sit right from the times when Ian Cole had tried to set up, and he did very, very successfully set up the Poetry Society of India here. And I remember the very initial meetings in which Keki was there and I was there, and we all wanted to, and of course, Ian Cole and several other people, Lakshmi Kannan, when we used to sit and deliberate on how to carry the project of poetry ahead. I was myself very nervous as a poet because my one leg was deeply into academics, and I was writing poetry, but on the side. And it was because I think I owe it to Keki a lot. I mean, the fact that he all the time was there quietly, encouraging, being a mentor of sorts, without really talking about it as a mentor. I remember his visits to Shimla when I was there as a fellow. And even if it were not to be a seminar on poetry, he would make very insightful comments on, say, for instance, Manto. And he would raise very down-to-earth kind of questions. And people who may have read Manto thoroughly, but would be foxed as to how to answer Keki's queries. And I remember my father was also one of the participants in this Manto seminar. And he and Keki had almost a kind of a public dialogue there on Manto, which was very enlightening because Manto was, of course, a stalwart writer, but in as far as Keki is concerned, his entry to Manto's world was through not Urdu Manto, but it was the English Manto, Khalid Hassan's Manto. And I remember the combat between my father and Keki, who was very realistically standing on the ground that no, but it means this because whatever he wanted to say, because it was Khalid Hassan's translation and somebody had to intervene and talk about it as to how the translation was a little different from the original Urdu. So these kinds of debates which we are having today in today's world about what translation can do to primary literature, they were talking, that generation was talking about it. And I would say I'm half a generation away from that. So I'm just about reaching that point, thanks to my gray hair and so on. So I wanted to I think of House of Words as a home of words, I really feel that because of the warmth that I have felt with Keki forever. I mean, just his being there in Delhi and being there in Shimla when I was there. So what one saw there was that there was a certain kind of, I think it was Harish who used the word bekhabri. I think that bekhabri in English, I would translate as a kind of a detachment, a detachment from whatever he was saying, even in his poetry. And why I say that is because only as our friend, I say friend for the academics, T.S. Eliot had to say that the personal emotion becomes impersonal in poetry, right? Impersonal emotion. I think this is exactly what happens to Keki's poetry. The personal emotion becomes impersonal in a way, which means it reaches out to everyone. And it's so concrete, it's very realistic. But I would not say that there is a complete lack of romanticism. No, there isn't. I was thinking of, the poem Map Maker, for instance, in which he says, perhaps I'll wake up on some alien shore in the shimmer of an aluminium dawn to find the sea talking to itself. And I feel the sea talking to itself is really the poet Keki talking to himself, always. So that kind of an emotion which is very self-reflexive also in the context of looking inwards, which very rarely you see in Keki. He is the outside and the inside come together very well. And that is why there is also a sense of detachment, and at the same time, he's on the ground. I wanted to talk a little bit about his Parsi identity in the context of marginalized identity. And, Ranjit, you've already talked about this, but I wanted to also say that it is probably this identity that took him into a kind of sphere of multiple languages, multiple geographies of sorts, because he was basically collecting insights from not just from within the country, within the plurality of cultures that we experience in this country, in our society, but also from outside. His knowledge of Latin and a bit of Greek culture and his research that went into his poetry, I think it was so strong that I would think of him as a researcher poet who could dwell into concrete realism as much in his novels as in poetry, which is very difficult. But there was also the abstraction of metaphors that he would bring in, and the local, which he would convert into the beyond through the travels, and the varied geographies and the varied styles and the tones that he would use in his poetry, where sarcasm would come in, sometimes irony, wit, humor, and then would carry philosophy very lightly. Very lightly would he carry philosophy within the, and no decoration, no exaggeration, no sentimentalism, and not thought heavy at all. So perfect association of sensibility. There was this, what we call, there are teachers of literature here, intellectual apprehension of emotion and emotional apprehension of intellect coming together. And that is why I think we cannot probably think in terms of he being only a classicist or only a romanticist. I think there was an amalgam of both. And hats off to him that he continued to do that almost, all through his life, whether in prose or in poetry. His poetry brings in a prosaic kind of an imagination also, and his prose would bring in the imagination of poetry. So I think it's a coming together, while at the same time, experimentation in form in a particular fashion. I really salute to him, and I believe that he would be seeing this program, listening to us, and I'm sure if thinking of us as, oh my God, so much of affection that he would reach out to us with. And I'm looking forward to meeting him very soon with his wonderful silences these days, beautiful silences. And then I begin to ask myself this question, the 2 or 3 times that I have visited him recently. Is there any need to have any language but silence, the language of silence? He communicates through silence these days much more. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Sukrita. And of course, by referring to the house as being exuding that warmth of a home rather than a mansion, you have really reinterpreted what this book we have been talking about for so long is all about. And so from not being an armchair intellectual that Ranjit just said, you talked about that deep philosophy and the currents of the interior monologue that is also a part of his writing, but gets again transmuted into something wider in terms of reaching out to the collective consciousness rather than being deeply personal and subjective. And of course, also, as you refer to, I think T.S. Eliot has been referred to many times, and what we probably wanted to really recover in terms of referring to Keki, because he combines the cerebral and the deeply sensitive, is that his intellect is at the tip of the senses. And with that, I would now like to invite the editor of, and who is quietly sitting there in Washington, and it must be only morning out there, unlike ours when we are reaching almost 9 o'clock. Usha Akela, who in Bangla, Akela means alone. And you have been able to put this book together with your energy as well as with your insight and foresight into how a Festschrift has to be compiled. And also the unique part, which also is an addition that I should have also referred to when I talked about Keki, was the imagery and aphorisms that you also included in this anthology. So, Usha, Akela is very, very well known in India. She also visited Calcutta University at a time when I had not retired. I'm surprised that whether I had a status other than that. So, yeah, so I was still teaching at the university when Usha came and read her poems and also met my students. She is a writer, poet, editor, and teacher, and has authored 5 books of poetry, 2 chapbooks, and scripted and produced 2 musical dramas. This bio note here is 1 page long. I will not read all of it because we are eager to listen to Usha and how she and the making of a house of words, but I have to refer to one of her publications, I Will Not Bear You Sons, published in 2021. It was also one which was published by the Spinfax Press, Australia, which is a feminist press, with a blurb by Anne Waldman. She is the founder of Daruwalla, and she's the first South Asian Diaspora Poetry Festival in the USA. She's the first one who started it, and she hosts a curated interview and conversation forum along with David Kopak regularly, and she has published in numerous literary journals around the world, and she has also participated in poetry festivals in Romania, Canada, Slovakia, Nicaragua, Macedonia, Colombia. How can you do this, Usha? And Slovenia. She has won literary prizes such as the Poetry Society of India 2019, and then the Nazim Hikmat Award, Open Road Review Prize, and the Egan Memorial Prize by Maryland Poetry Review. Over to you, Usha.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Namaskar from Austin, not Washington.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm a bit bereft of words. I miss Keki Daruwalla very dearly in this moment, and I wish he'd been here. I hope he's watching this on YouTube. Thank you all for the incisive remarks, for the insightful critiques on Keki's work, and for being here to raise a toast to a house of words. This is a very special volume because it was constructed lovingly by a community to provide a roof for all of us who love Keki's work. I'd like to think this is a landmark event in the sense of a publication because I'm sure the Sahitya Academy has published things like akin to the Festschrift, but I think this kind of opens the gate in a very marked way, and I hope many more follow. So going back a bit to the editorial, I don't know how much time I have. I would love to share the editorial version, but I first need to thank quite a few people. And I also need to make a few preliminary remarks. And if there's some time, I'd like to talk about the editorial version and actually talk about how the book was made and what my vision was when I brought the various chapters together. In the editorial, I make a comment that it's a literary manual of sorts to experience and understand Mr. Keki and Daruwalla, the writer and the man, not just the writer or the man, but the writer and the man. And what I'm extremely happy is he was part of the making of the book to some extent. He saw versions of the work in progress, which I think is really important. He participated in the chapter of aphorisms because he'd been compiling them and he was very gung-ho about them and he shared that with me. He participated in both the interviews. And for me, I think it's very heartening today to know that he saw versions of this book in the making because I made it a point to share it with him. So he knew what was going on. He saw the book when it had come to good shape. So that I'm happy that he was aware, and that I think is very important to me personally. Quite incredibly, I think these memoirs, these short tracts of writing, They're all 500 to about 750 words. Remarkably, what has happened is the book ends up capturing a slice of history in Indian letters. And I was not aware that that was going to happen. And I think that's the gift of this project, because the very base, really the insignia of India's writerly world, from literary events to publishing history, from publishing policies to landmark addas and festivals, from literary commentary to shared personal histories, from craft to storytelling. It's really a breathtaking glimpse into the writerly life in India. And this is something that wasn't foreseen. And I think this is something that the book captures very, very significantly. And I think from a heart point of view, um, the book is an outstanding testimonial of camaraderie, collegiality, kinship, friendships, making a statement that these can exist in spite of the rigors of academia and the creative life with all their demands and pressures. It's really a testimonial to friendship. So this brings me to the question, why did I initiate this project? And again, in my editorial, I say, friendship was the root spark for it. But I think more importantly, and more, I think, meaningfully, we need to remember our greats in the literature world. We need to remember the great minds in literature. We have to try to record the impact they have on the literary imagination. We need to celebrate their particular flavor, their legacy, the spectrum of talent. And we have to try to grasp the very vibration at the heart of their creative prowess, because each one is so unique. So my fervent hope is that this will stand for many years as a habitat for those seeking to know Keki's work and personality. I have to thank a few people. Of course, starting with the very electric charge at the core of the book, Mr. Keki and Daruwalla. With Keki, there's something outstandingly different, which has been reiterated by the contributors and by the panelists. A celebration about him, it can't just be about his prodigious talent. It has to be also about the man. And that, I think, is something so unique to him. And this was the consistent picture that was emerging about him. Regarding his creative genius, time and time again, the memoirs talk about his, one-of-a-kind wit and humor, his merciless observations, his sweeping historical and geographical awareness, his reading voice and delivery of his poems. Whatever he wrote about, he wrote so powerfully, and it made it important enough to write about. That was, I think, his genius. It didn't matter what he wrote about. Once it was written and you read it through the eyes of Keki Daruwalla, you realize it was important to write about. Regarding his electric personality, again, there's the reiteration of his honesty, his courage, his integrity, his core of modesty and humility, his razor-sharp memory, his ability to keep things real, his ability not to indulge hierarchies in personal relationships, his proclivity to mentorship, and at the core of it, and in spite of it, a generous and giving heart that has impacted so many. And then there was mention of contradictions, simplicity and sophistication, intellect and heart, and so on. So very rarely there's so towering a talent and fame combined with accessibility. And he doesn't hide behind projected greatness or exclusivity, and he's present. And he's been present to all of us and for all of us, really in an incredible way that I think is really a lesson to all of us on how to practice literature, that one need not disappear behind our work. It doesn't make one less important to be part of a community. And I think he lived and showed us how to do that. So my first thanks, of course, is to Keki. I'd then like to thank the Sahitya Academy team, Rao Garu, who accepted the project and was willing to publish the project, to Malashri Lal, who was a silent support throughout, Krishna Kimbahune ji, who was my point of contact for 2.5 years, and I'd like to say we came out of it a bit bruised maybe, but we came out of it with a friendship intact. And I want to make special mention about the reviewer. I don't know who she is, and I'm really so glad that the Sahitya Academy kept a protocol. We went through a reviewing process, and because of that reviewer, really the book is what it is today. She was just fantastic. I think the comments, 99% simply obeyed the critique that was given, and the book is what it is really because of her astute eye. Then the contributors, and as you've all read and all commented on, it's really a scintillating array of writing. And I think I should mention everyone today because not everyone is here on this panel. Obviously, as a panel is limited, not everyone could be here or invited to talk. So Adil Jasawala, Anita Nahal, Arundhati Subramaniam, Vasudhara Roy, Debashri Lahiri, Firdaus Gandavia, Harish Trivedi, Kashyana Singh, Kavita Ezekiel, Lakshmi Sri Banerjee, Malashri Lal, Meenakshi Mohan, Menaka Shivdasani, Namita Gokhale, Narendranath Vora, Pramila Venkateshwaran, Priya Sarukai Chabria, Rachna Joshi, Radha Chakravarti, Rukmini Bhaya Nair, Rupin Desai, Salim Piradina, Sanjukta Dasgupta, Shanta Acharya, Sridhara Swami, Sukrita Paul, Thomas, AJ Thomas, Urna Bose, Yezad Kapadia. My heartfelt thanks to each and every one of you. I'd like to thank Penguin and Speaking Tiger for the permissions you gave us to cite material. I want to thank the Hearth Within, because it was really from that core the idea of this book emerged. So thank you very much for those beginnings. I want to thank Vasudhara Roy very specifically because she was an incredible pillar of support throughout this journey of editing and writing for me. I'd like to thank the reviewers and the reviews that are coming out and will be coming out. And my heartfelt thanks to Keki's daughters, Anaita and Ruxen, who have become very dear family, and for embracing me into your fold. I think really in terms of thanks, forgive me if I'm forgetting anyone, but really, I think that kind of I think covers it as far as I can remember. I don't know if I have time. Maybe the timekeepers there can tell me, do I have the time to talk about this from an editorial point of view?
Yes, about 5 minutes.
Okay,
Is that all
I
right?
think,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely. I think that's more than enough. So I'm
Yeah.
going to quickly skim through the layout, talk a little bit about why I chose what to do and how I did it. The title of the book, there's been a lot of appreciation for the title of the book, and I'm really happy to say I'd shortlisted 2 or 3, and Keki chose this one. So it means a lot to me that he had the most important decision, and that was the title he chose. It's from a poem to his daughter. Regarding the editorial note, I read the book before the event today, and I noticed that my editorial is quite reticent. The editorial note is very reticent, and I think it was very deliberate. In an anthology of this kind, I felt the sooner I got out of the way personally, it would do justice to the book, because there were a number of voices to hear, and it was not my voice to monopolize the book. So I think I made the right decision. With a certain reticence that I adopted, I did not indulge in the number of man, but I wanted to make that space for his talent and for his personality. The introduction is by Vasudhara Roy, and I think some of the finest words and language in the book is in her beautiful introduction, and I'm glad we were able to put it on the back of the book. So thank you, Vasudhara, for that. People were talking about classical writing, and you must read the blurb on the book to see really what that means. I Let's see what's next. The reflections. That's a chapter with longer essays. And there are about 7 of them: Arundhati, Malashri, Basudhara, A.J. Thomas, Rupin, Urna, Bose, and Harish. I don't have the time to comment on each of them, but these are 7 really fine essays. Some of them, a couple of them are reprints, and most of them are original writings for the book. And I must say that I think Keki's favorite was Urna's essay, and that touched him very, very deeply. And I'd like to make one comment on Harish's essay, and I think, you hear the word felicity bandied about, felicity in writing, and I think you have to read Harish's essay to really see what that adjective means. So it's a very fine, I think, a very fine beginning to the book. These essays talk about his craft in various ways. What I think is missing is an essay on the political columns, and this will be my regret about the book, that I wasn't able to get that material in time, and it's still something that I think needs to be done. And also, I think an essay on his travel writing is another thing missing. There are 26 memoirs, which are the crux and foundation of this house. And I think why this book is important is because of these 26 essays. The aphorisms were very dear to Keki. They're all unpublished material, and that was quite a delight to go into. While going through what he'd given me, I realized that there were plenty of aphorisms in his poetry, so I read through his works to compile a list of that. His imagery, it was very important to to write something about the imagery, because in Keki's poetics, I came to understand that for him, imagery was more important than metaphor. And I thought that was a very, very significant aspect of his poetics, and I wanted to devote a chapter to that. The interviews, I think, probably the most valuable part of the book, in the sense these are the last interviews he's done. It's a 12-page interview on his poetry and a 6-page interview on his prose, on his fiction by Firdaus. And this is incredible. I mean, this is Keki's last word on his craft. So I feel very fortunate that I was able to work on that with him in time. And I think that's about it. That's all I've wanted to say. And I want to end with gratitude to all of you for being here, for celebrating such a beloved figure in Indian letters. And thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you, Usha. That was a very, very comprehensive assessment of the contributions of the many extremely well-known writers who consider Keki not only as a poet or a novelist or a columnist, but as a poet comrade. And so I am really, really very happy that you could be with us today. And I'm sure you will hold a number of other virtual or maybe even in-person events to celebrate this book, because that's what you have been writing in the emails, that maybe you can include the ones who could not be here this evening.
Yeah.
And so now the convener of the English Board of Sahitya Academy, who has been sitting there in a very disciplined way for almost 2 hours now, may I invite Professor Malashri to join us and tell us about her long association with Keki Daruwalla, and also to bring this event to a close. Professor Malashri, Department of English, University of Delhi, specializes in literature and women's studies, about which she has 16 books, and I'm not reading out that very, very long descriptive titles that I have here. One, of course, many of you know about, Finding Radha, Cosmopolitan Spaces, Betrayed by Hope, and the latest book, which is about Lakshmi and the goddess who gives. She received research fellowships at Harvard University, Bellagio, and Newcastle. Lal is currently the convener of the English Advisory Board of Sahitya Academy and also member of the General Council of Sahitya Academy. Over to you, Malashri Lal.
Thank you very much, Sanjukta, and good evening to everybody. I'd like to begin by expressing gratitude to Usha Akela and to all the panelists here, and indeed to the Sahitya Academy for bringing out this landmark publication. And I want to spend a few minutes to first say why this is such a significant piece of writing and a book that we will all read and look up to, and almost treat as a kind of example of how we can come out with an extremely useful and readable book. Keki, Daruwalla, and I, like so many others on the panel, have known each other for over 40 years. So the first thing I do know, I want to say, is that he has a kind of timelessness. And this book captures that timelessness and its relevance, the energy of Keki's creativity and imagination in the memories that people have put together in those 26 essays. So not only is it a book about Keki, but as one of you said, it's also a slice of history, because the writers in the book are also extremely well-known people who have created the history of Indian literature in English and who have cited their long association with Keki as a person and also as a writer. So it is that very different dimension to a Festschrift that we get in this book. In my own association with Keki, the first time I met him was because of that story called Love Across the Salt Desert. It's a short story which was prescribed in the University of Delhi curriculum. And I set up an appointment to see him. And I, of course, expected to meet a very stern bureaucrat and was a bit worried about how this meeting might go. What I found instead was a most generous, gentle, hospitable person and an extremely good, eloquent speaker and a friend over the years. What I'd like to therefore then move on to say is that the timelessness of Keki is visible from that moment when that book was, that particular story became a part of our curriculum, to the last book that he gifted to some of us called Going, which is also a collection of short stories. So although Keki is so very well known as a poet, somehow to me, the fact of his jewel-like short stories is extremely important. And that's what I have written about. And that's what I would like to draw attention to. But in the context of the larger aims of this get-together, the Festschrift and what it has achieved and what so many of you have put through in a beautiful manner, let us also celebrate the multilingual readership that Keki has and the multicultural interests that he displays in his work. It is in fact because of that that we get stories that are located in the experience of small towns and also stories that are located in very cosmopolitan environments like Bombay. The subjects are those of rural interest and also European art. So looking at that particular span, I called my tribute to Keki the new cosmopolitan. And that is a way of showing my respect and appreciation of the range of his subjects. And in that range, not only do we have his engagement with urbanization, with international topics, his troubled relationship with issues of violence, issues of civic disruption. So many of you have talked about the role that he played as a writer in bringing such subjects to our contemporary thinking and reading. But at the same time, I want to introduce a subject that nobody else has talked about, his association with loneliness. One of my favorite stories in Keki's oeuvre is something called Bird Island. It was written some time ago, but he included it in his last collection of short stories in Going. And it's the story of parents whose son disappears. And they give up on finding him till the father, who absolutely refuses to believe that his son is no more, goes on a journey and finally discovers the son in a completely unrecognizable condition, marooned on an island on which there's only that one human being and flocks of birds. And the story sort of ends there. It is metaphorical of perhaps the loneliness that each of us has, yet we are surrounded by people. Perhaps it is a way of saying that we are all islands unto ourselves, that we belong to a larger map. And as Sukrita pointed out, map making and geography and history are very much a part of the interests that Keki had and brought into his fiction, his poetry, his short stories, his journalistic writings, etc. I want to read just one line from some of his prose works that, again, have not come up in the discussion so far. And I'm quoting from Keki. It is not just that the writer has changed his views, his reaction to events, or the way he sees life now as against the way he looked at it earlier. The core problem lies in the writer not being the same man. The bridge with his own past has disappeared. I found those lines very moving, that for 45 years he has been writing continuously. We see him in his timeless personality. We see him as a friend, as a mentor, as a person who is constantly renewing the way in which he writes and the subjects that he chooses. This Festschrift is a very beautiful and comprehensive tribute to the diversity of Keki's writing, and also a great tribute to the friendship, the warmth and affection that Keki has shown to so many of us here, and as a personality, as an individual, as a writer, the impact that Keki has had over a long time and will continue to have in the future. So thank you, Usha, for bringing this together. And I thank all the panelists for their very insightful views. And for Sahitya Academy, I think it is indeed a landmark publication. Thank you.
So, thank you, Mala, for bringing forward a few more insights into Keki as a writer and Keki as a person. And I think now this session is coming to a close, unless somebody wants to say something. And we look forward to the journey of this book, A House of Words. And I hope this house will find a home in your own residences, all of us, those who have the book. And with Keki smiling there, I hope he's listening to us. And let us also wish him a long life and a long writing career. He should come out of this illness fast. Thank you so much, everyone, and
Thank you.
good night.
Okay, thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for
Good night.
the wonderful evening.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Sanjukta ji, for so nicely moderating the session.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Usha ji, joining from all the way from America. So,
Thank you, everyone.
yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Ranjit ji and Sukrita ji, Mala ji, of course, Vasudha ji. So soon we will meet in some other platform. Thank you so much.
Thank
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 you.
Thank you, Raul.
Good night, everyone.